Hello, my name is Christine Casey, and this Royal Dublin Society Library Series lecture will focus upon European craftsmen in 18th century Britain and Ireland, the subject of Making Magnificence, a book published by Yale University Press, which won the Alice Davis Hitchcock Medallion of the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain in 2018. I will begin by contextualizing the research for the book and telling you something of how it came to be, before explaining its major themes and the new research which has stemmed from it. An interest in the spread of architectural taste across Europe began during a doctoral study of 18th century architectural books and prints as a medium of stylistic dissemination. Prints were used for instruction in drawing in the workshops of artists and craftsmen, and also in the drawing schools of the Dublin Society. On completion of the PhD, I was appointed curator at Newman House, University College Dublin, which comprises two city residences of 1738 and 1765 respectively. The earliest, which you see here, richly decorated by continental craftsmen. The later house by local craftsmen from the so-called Dublin School of Plasterwork. It was on one evening during that period, gazing at the Lafranchini ceiling in the saloon of number 85, that I first began to wonder about the spread of style through the lives of the migrant stuccatori who had made their way from Italian-speaking Switzerland to Ireland. I wondered about the families they left behind, wives, children, parents. But other more architectural subjects beckoned. However, after a decade spent carefully analysing Dublin buildings of the 18th century, I then fully realised the impact of the Lafranchini on native Irish craftsmen, and in particular on the so-called Dublin School of Plasterwork, which flourished during the 1760s. A sabbatical year in Italy allowed me to return to that interest, peaked so many years before, and to travel to Ticino in Switzerland, which you see here, to start tracking down my stuccatori. Although we knew the basic facts of their lives, we did not know where they trained, nor the projects that they worked on before travelling to Britain and Ireland. The Holy Grail beckoned. But as in so many cases, the trail ran dry. The Lafranchini simply would not reveal themselves, no matter how hard I tried. While it was possible after a year to determine where they trained and to identify some potential sites where they worked, there were simply so many migrant craftsmen active in Europe at this time that it was like hunting for a needle in a haystack. And here you see some examples of the amazing work throughout Europe, at Vienna and at Salzburg. But this work stretches from Russia right across to Britain. So the collywobbles set in. Should I give it up as a bad job, publish an article or two, and go back to mainstream architecture? Colleagues thought so. Is this really architectural history? One well-intentioned scholar asked. That did it. Well, scrub it all out, I said. And what are we left with? In the case of so many Georgian houses in Ireland, not much. Of course, decoration is a fundamental part of architecture. And so I began to ransack history to prove my case. Raphael offered the best support. For this great painter and architect who was appointed superintendent of the antiquities of Rome, architecture without ornament was ossea senza carne, bone without flesh. As you see here in the great baths in Rome, which Raphael had in his care. And you also see here his work in the Villa Madama in Rome, which is sumptuously decorated after the manner of the ancients. But how to proceed with the Lafranchini? In the end, I decided to tackle not the needle, but the haystack itself. The wider Ticinese phenomenon in Northern Europe from 1700 to 1760, which until then had been covered only in localized studies, with little beyond a single chapter in the English language. It was a daunting prospect, but would begin with the wider group of craftsmen, of stuccatori, who had travelled to England, including the Lafranchini, a team, or squadra as it was known, led by the virtuoso stuccatore Giuseppe Artari. Artari is the only one of the 8 craftsmen who migrated from the Ticino region to Britain for whom we have a portrait, which you see here from a text of 1774, The History of the Best Artists of Switzerland. He was considered a virtuoso in his day. This manageable team of artist craftsmen, led by Artari and his associate Baguti, would provide the focus, the itinerary, and the works in Europe, England, and Ireland for an analysis of the wider movement of men and materials. Who were these men? What was their world? And how did they live? The principals of the British group, Giuseppe Artari, Giovanni Battista Baguti, and Francesco Antonio Vasali, all came from the area of Lake Lugano known as the Mendrisiotto, or the most southerly part of the Swiss Confederation. And you see here 2 maps of this region, one modern map showing you the relationship of Ticino to Italy and northern Switzerland, and this wonderful coloured map of the mid-18th century. You also see here an example of an altar rail made from multicoloured stone. And this region, why did you get so many amazing craftspeople coming from this region? Because this region really is the foothills of the Alps, and it has the most amazing, precious coloured stone. And so these men became expert in the quarrying of stone, in the cutting of stone, and in all the byproducts of that, including plasterwork, because that, of course, used marble dust as one of the elements. The villages of our craftsmen, Arogno, Rovio, Riva San Vitale, were connected by proximity and kinship. The Lafranchini came from a different part of the region, higher up, and you see it on the map, the village of Bironico, high up in the Sottoceneri, or foothills of the Alps, near Bellinzona. On a map, the Ticino resembles an upturned triangle, with its wide base facing north and fitted into the foothills of the Alps, while the southern point stretches into Italy, flanked by Lakes Maggiore and Como. Switzerland was then, as now, the crossroads of Europe, and the Lafranchini village of Bironico straddled one of its principal arteries, the route north to the San Gotthard Pass. And here you see Turner's amazing view of 1805 of the San Gotthard Pass. This treacherous pass and its competitors, the St. Bernard Pass and the Brenner Passes, were the threshold from the Mediterranean world to Northern Europe. In winter, when work ceased on northern building sites, the craftsmen who could afford to do so, and who wished to do so, would travel home through these passes, arriving in November and returning to Northern Europe in mid-February. through treacherous cliffs of snow, so volatile that it was said even the human voice could trigger an avalanche. Such risks for a livelihood might suggest that these were economic migrants with no choice but to travel north. But this was not the case, as there was also much work in Italy. But fortunes could be made further afield. Our craftsmen were entrepreneurs, and they were seeking greener pastures. So as work declined in Rome, Venice, and elsewhere, families of craftsmen crossed the Alps to the cities, courts, and monasteries of Germany and Austria, where vast building projects sustained them for generations. They were not poor, like those who remained to farm the hillsides of the lakes. On the contrary, their families paid substantial sums to well-known masters for their apprenticeships, not unlike the costs of a university education today. They travelled light and walked at a steady rate of 5 kilometres per hour, carrying some of the equipment that they needed with them, and taking several weeks to make the journey from the lakeside villages northward to these German cities and courts. And here you see one of my favourite villages in Ticino, near the border with Italy. This is the birthplace of Francesco Antonio Vassalli, for whom a street was named, and you can see Via dell'Inglese, the street of the Englishman. And this, as you can see, is right down on the side of Lake Lugano. Travelling light is evidenced by this tiny notebook. And you can see I have placed beside it one of my very small pearl earrings. So that gives you a sense of the scale of this notebook, which was discovered in the wall of a house on the edge of Lake Lugano, and does full justice to the term pocketbook. It dates to about 1680. It's leather-bound and gilded, although as you can see some of the gilding has been lost, and it is filled with notes on drawing, on materials, and on travel expenses. It belongs to the family who found it in the wall, not the original Castelli family. And when I went to visit them, to my amazement and trepidation, they gave me this precious object to take back to my hotel in Lugano, so I would have the entire evening poring over its contents. So an astonishing record of this journey northward from the lakeside villages to the cities of Germany and Austria. Giuseppe Artari was the star of the group, as I've said. He was a figurista, which was a modeler of the human figure. And he trained in the workshop of his father, Giovanni Battista Artari, and also worked extensively in Germany before and after his migration to England. And here you see, beside the portrait of Artari, an example of his really wonderful figure modelling skills on the ceiling of a house in England, Moore Park. And you can see these trophies of arms and bound figures of slaves on the ceiling. Francesco Antonio Vassalli, the Inglese, was 14 years Artari's junior, and he was the wunderkind of the group. And he also emerged from a family workshop active in Germany and the Low Countries. And here you see the very beautiful and restrained, really neoclassical work of Artari at Shugborough in Staffordshire in England in 1748. The cities and courts which initially drew the craftsmen, the stuccatori, across the Alps were the residences of the elector princes and bishops of the Holy Roman Empire. the vast German-speaking lands of Austria and Germany and their dependencies, and especially the imperial court city of Vienna. In Vienna, teams of Ticinese craftsmen worked on the city palaces of the imperial courtiers, not least Prince Eugene of Savoy, whose Belvedere Palace, which many of you may know it now houses the wonderful Museum of Modern Art in Vienna, is filled with elaborate ceilings, really sculpted in lime plaster. Austria and the imperial army was the bulwark of Europe against the military ambitions of the Turks, whose army besieged the city in 1683, and victory was celebrated in the construction of city palaces, of course the Belvedere being one of the most spectacular. One of Giuseppe Artari's major patrons was the victorious general Ludwig Eberhard von Baden-Baden, popularly known as Türken Louis, for his defeat of the Turkish army. And here you see his palace, Schloss Rastatt in Baden-Württemberg, near the border with France. And the Artari workshop were employed here at Rastatt on a sequence of rooms. You can see the plan with the great hall at the centre, followed by antechambers, audience chambers, and finally the state bed chambers at either end of the sequence. And you can also see some of this spectacular ornamental and figurative modelling by the Artari workshop. Another patron was the Palatine Elector, who built the famous hunting lodge at Bensberg. And another was the Cologne Elector, whose summer palace, Schloss Augustusburg at Brühl near Cologne, would entice Artari back to Germany from England in the 1740s and allowed him to display to the full his spectacular figure modelling skills. Indeed, Artari appears to have travelled between Britain and Germany throughout his career, a pretty long commute, in search of ever better commissions. Part of the apparatus of art history is to think about style as a sequence of forms. So we move from the Baroque through to the Rococo, through to the Neoclassical. One of the really remarkable things about the work of the Stuccatori is that they slip the leash of art history. They don't show this sequence. They are capable of offering their clients a range of different stylistic or formal conventions, even in the one building. A hall can be different to some of the other rooms of the palace. And our Stuccatori who come to Britain show a remarkable variety, and you can see that here in this slide, where you see the rhetorical late Baroque figure of Saint Sebastian in the cathedral at Fulda. Below it at Rastatt, a lighter, more French-influenced, like the early Rococo that you get coming from France. And then the large image is the Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London, which was worked on by Artari's team, in particular by a man called Giovanni Battista San Michele. And here they are working for the British architect James Gibbs. And they are working in a quite strict classical style. So, as I say, the stylistic evolution that we consider within art history is rather turned on its head by the work of the Stuccatori. But how, you may ask, did these craftsmen acquire these remarkable and chameleon-like skills, which allowed them to move from one prestigious commission to the next? They began young, usually about 12 years old, to serve an apprenticeship of 5 years, during which they assisted the principal craftsmen, preparing and carrying materials, cleaning up, and for a legally contracted time period. Their apprenticeship contracts have this written in that they would spend time every week learning the rudiments of modelling and drawing. This was really important because otherwise they would be really exploited. And we hear stories of the young apprentices being beaten like animals. So it was a tough education, but one which produced high skills. And here you see an early 18th century view of a plasterer on a now look at the scaffold, it's quite a scanty scaffold. There were more elaborate ones, but you can see that he is wearing a hat because this is a messy business. And we're looking at a viscous material, we're looking at droplets falling on the person who is very often lying on their back on the scaffold. And here you can see the use of the mortarboard and the trowel. And you also see an example of the material. The material in Europe used by the stuccatori was a mixture of gypsum, marble dust, water. In Northern Europe, gypsum was used where it could be found, but where it couldn't be found, and that was in most places, lime was used. So you had a mixture of lime and sand and animal hair as a strengthening and binding medium. Animal hair was never used in the Mediterranean. And there's a funny story actually in the 20th century about plasterers from, I think it was Barcelona, working for an Irish architect in Spain and being told to use animal hair and were absolutely horrified. This was something that they had never heard of. Labour-saving devices were used called running molds, which you can see being used here. This is actually work on the conservation of Longford Cathedral. It's recent work after the fire in Longford Cathedral. And you can also see what the plasterers call on the hand here, fine stuff, which is the finishing coat, because you have 3 coats in these interiors, progressing to the finest on the upper layer. And that coat would often contain a mixture of lime and gypsum in Northern Europe. Something to bear in mind is that gypsum dries very quickly. Think of plaster of Paris. That's gypsum. Whereas lime dries slowly. So if you're working with gypsum, you have to work pretty quickly. If you're working with lime, you have more time in the drying process. Sometimes it's possible to see the faltering hand of the apprentice alongside that of the journeyman or master. And at Carton House in County Kildare, this is an image from the ceiling of the saloon of Apollo and Daphne. And Apollo, of course, pursued Daphne, and she turns into a tree, and you can see her hand here raised, and the hand is becoming foliage in a rather awkward manner, whereas some passages of this ceiling are absolutely superlative. Look at the little putti swinging on the oak garlands, for example, above the figures, and we'll see more of these wonderful figures later on. Drawing was based on copying other drawings or engravings of paintings which were circulated among the workshops and passed from generation to generation. So the young apprentices learned from copying engravings and copying drawings as well as the day-to-day work in assisting their master. Several collections of these workshop drawings survive, including one in Artari's neighbouring village of Rovio, again near the edge of the lake. These drawings range from decorative details to whole schemes to copies of elements from famous painted decoration. And the figure of the ignudo here with the medallion is actually a copy of work in painted work in the Farnese Gallery in Rome. After 5 years of drawing, of preparing materials, of modelling, the apprentice was qualified to work as a journeyman. and capable of providing his clients with presentation drawings, though with varying levels of skill. However, the young Giuseppe Artari, we know from childhood, was considered a virtuoso draftsman. And from the surviving letters of craftsmen, we know the hothouse competitive atmosphere of the great cities and courts, where trained stuccatori, skilled journeymen, still felt overwhelmed by the skills of their peers. "There are too many virtuosi here," wrote one young, dispirited stuccatore fresh out of his apprenticeship. And yet, too often in the histories of the period, the work of these craftsmen and their associates in other crafts are overlooked, and accolades for palaces, churches, public buildings are laid at the feet either of the patron or of the designer, the architect, who since antiquity has been distinguished from those who realize his designs, or who now realize his and her designs. A central feature of the book has been an effort to redress this overemphasis on conceptual design by exploring the relationship of design and making. And I quote, "Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with the names of kings. Was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone?" wrote the poet Bertolt Brecht. The same may be said of craftsmen in every genre. Architectural history focuses on the process, largely on the process of design through drawings, and very often black and white photographs, which do little justice to the materiality of buildings and have little to do, very often, with the experience of immersion in a structure. I want you to imagine yourselves entering this stair hall at Castletown House and ascending this great stair, framed by its walls of modelled plaster. For in real life, our attention is mobile. The experience of buildings is temporal, sequential, a series of images and sensations that unfold, influenced by light, temperature, sound, mood, and expectation. And you can see the various elements here of that stair hall, which you would encounter as you ascend the stair, with the wonderful bust just catching the light from the window on that second landing. Ornament plays a fundamental role in the experience of architecture, as does the hand of the craftsman in achieving it. It was the fluid, tacit, mind-to-hand work of the skilled craftsman which transformed the bare brick or masonry box by enlivening the walls with sculptural ornament. Throughout history, architects have sought craftsmen of the highest ability and have acknowledged their indebtedness to them. A building, though conceived in the mind, must be brought into being by the muscular action of the human hand. Getting inside this fundamental relationship between design and making lies at the heart of making Magnificence and has been at the core of my research since then. It's not an easy task. If only I could be a fly on the wall in some of those conversations between the architect and the craftsman in this period. Evidence, therefore, for this dialectic or dialogue between architect and craftsman is a continuing challenge. However, by comparing preliminary drawings to realized schemes and analysing the solo productions of craftsmen unfettered by architects proves fruitful. And here you see a drawing by the Lafranchini for a ceiling at Kildare House, now Leinster House, and beside it, the ceiling as executed. And you can see that in the drawing, they have filled up the space with ornament. It's full, whereas in the realized ceiling, a lot of that ornament has been edited out. Most likely in dialogue with the architect and also perhaps with the client. It emerged during my research for the book that for craftsmen in this period, ornament equaled money. The more ornament, the richer the work, the greater satisfaction in the work, and the greater reward. In the churches of the Ticino and neighbouring valleys, returned craftsmen working gratis for their home parishes filled these interiors with as much ornament as their surfaces could hold, a measure of their skills and standing in the village community. And no matter how fine the modelling, strange jumps in scale or overfilled surfaces are testament to the absence of the architect's guiding hand and the horror vacui or fear of the void, which is characteristic of 18th century craftsmanship. By contrast, the drawings and instructions of architects like James Gibbs in London, Filippo Juvara in Turin, or Richard Castle in Dublin show the efforts of architects to rein in the excesses of their stuccatory by editing their sumptuous drawings to arrive at a clearer overall structure. And here we see Ditchley in Oxfordshire, a house partially designed by James Gibbs, and this is a ceiling designed by Gibbs and executed by the stuccatori, which you can see is immensely controlled. And yet when we look at the actual detail of the entablature with its cornucopia, it looks like a scroll, and then you realize it's this horn of plenty. There is wonderful invention within the detailing itself. I argue that the finest results were produced by architects and master craftsmen working in tandem. Where the craftsmen are completely controlled, the work can be dull. Where there is dialogue, you can find the most amazing results, such as here in the Royal Palace in Turin, this staircase designed by Juvara, which was for actually a wedding celebration. Imagine ascending this for the great party following the royal wedding. So the ornament enhances the entire experience of the building. And the gestural manipulation of tools and materials is hugely important. So here we see one of the finest episodes in the stucco decoration at Carton House in County Kildare. This is by Paolo Lafranchini, who is the principal, the eldest of the three Lafranchini brothers. There can be no doubt that this is his work. It's really superb. It depicts Bacchus and Ariadne. Bacchus finds Ariadne abandoned on a beach in Crete, and you have this loving relationship between them. And again, we have this marvelous handling of the acanthus detail and of those little putti swinging on oak garlands, which are the unifying feature of this remarkable ceiling. The impact of these virtuoso works on contemporary viewers and patrons was vital to their prosperity. In Ireland, where patrons struggled to entice European and British artists and architects, the rarity of highly skilled craftsmen ensured that the Lafranchini brothers dominated the market for 3 decades. Some measure of the cachet associated with their work is provided by an account of an impromptu visit to Curramore in County Waterford by a group on horseback, including the Archbishop of Armagh. So we're looking now at the early 1750s. And this is a detail of the ceiling of the room in question. So the agent reported to his master. They passed the house unobserved to the front gate and never sent a servant to the house to desire to have the gate or door opened. Mr. Kerr was at Knocknacrohy and the front gate locked. They forced the lock and bolt of the gate and rode into the front up to the door. Betty, the housemaid, was opening the windows by lifting up the sashes to air the house when the Archbishop unlit at the door and he spoke to her. She said she would go for the key and open the door directly. He said he was in haste and desired her not to, but to hand him out a chair, which she did, and he went into the window with the gentleman and desired her to show him the new room, which she did, and the new apartment below. He was in a great hurry and went off out through the dressing room door and would not suffer the maid to go for the key. This gives some sense of the excitement among the local aristocracy and their guests, the Archbishop of Armagh, about this work which had just been executed by the Lafranchini brothers at Curramore. Such was the demand for their skills that the stuccatori could consort with the elite of Italian cultural producers, opera singers, and particularly the castrati, who commanded vast sums of money for their performances in the capital cities of Europe and Britain. Paolo Lafranchini's younger brother, Pietro, shared lodging rooms with the celebrated castrato Giusto Ferdinando Tenducci, whose Covent Garden landlord was a friend of the stuccatori. Pietro Lafranchini was then working on one of the grandest picture galleries, sadly lost, that of Northumberland House in London, in the Strand, and was earning very large sums of money, which he duly invested in bringing an Italian opera troupe to London, only to lose his money and end up in an unresolved legal dispute. But the transcript of this case, which is in the Public Record Office in London, with its description of coffee houses, comic opera, and migrant opera stars, suggests that the stuccatori had a fine old time of it in their adoptive homes. In the provinces of Britain and in Ireland, where even foreign gardeners were hard to come by, the stuccatori could name their price. And one of the documents which first attracted me to them was the complaint of an irate aristocratic patron, Louisa Connolly, who wrote to her sister, and I quote, "If he charges anything of that sort to Mr. Connolly, there will be a fine scold in store for his honour." She is writing about Filippo Lafranchini, whom she wants to decorate this wonderful stair hall at Castletown. He charged a high fee, and the fee was paid. Louisa's sister was Emily, Countess of Kildare, who lived nearby at Carton House, which had been decorated by the Lafranchini by her parents-in-law, perhaps in anticipation of her marriage to their only surviving son and of his subsequent elevation to a dukedom. Emily's grandfather had been an illegitimate son of Charles II, and her father was the Duke of Richmond. The scheme is one of the most elaborate in Britain and Ireland and depicts the council of the gods, with more emphasis on loving than counselling. Like so many schemes, it is the transmedial expression of painted models. Roman 17th and 18th century paintings admired by collectors such as the Kildares and now available in modelled plaster at a fraction of the cost and with a great deal more impact than a single painting. So here you see the source of the subject matter for the Bacchus and Ariadne, which we saw earlier. And this is a painting in a collection actually in Rome by Benedetto Luti, Bacchus and Ariadne of 1713. But it is most likely, in fact, that the Benedetto Luti and the Lafranchini derive from another exemplar, but this illustrates the transmedial nature of stucco decoration in this period. The Lafranchini completed the job within a year, and they were paid £500 for this work at Carton. And this was more than the average annual income of a gentry family in the period, but less than the cost of 5 good full-length paintings. The brothers Paolo and Filippo Lafranchini and their anonymous associates executed different parts of the scheme at Carton, the most conspicuous parts being executed by the highly skilled Paolo and the more dimly lit section by Filippo, whose handling of anatomy, as we have seen in the Apollo and Daphne, left something to be desired. This is one of my favourite parts of the scheme, 2 little putti seated on the cornice, looking down into the room. One wondering, he seems to be wondering if he will do something, and the other pointing into the room. And I imagine that this is a joke or a jest. Perhaps this was the eating parlour of the Kildare family. And you can see that this figure is pointing into the room. So you can imagine that there might have been some fun also associated with this decorative scheme. The scheme at Carton for the Kildares really was modelled on very ambitious schemes which were being executed in Britain in the 1720s. Not least at Houghton Hall in Norfolk, which you see here, which was the home of Sir Robert Walpole. And the Artari team worked for Walpole in the mid-1720s. We know they were there because the records for the wine which was supplied to them survives, and also some building accounts, but the wine is the key, and this was actually something that was very often part of the contract of the stuccatori, because the wine that they could procure in Northern Europe they considered beneath their taste. Another scheme which was of great importance and which was used on the cover, the jacket of Making Magnificence, is the Marble Hall at Clandon Park in Surrey for Lord Onslow, again in the mid to late 1720s. The ceiling of the Marble Hall was executed by Giuseppe Artari. Sadly, a year after I had visited and studied the work, the house, which is the property of the National Trust, was almost completely destroyed by fire in the space of little more than an hour. It is now open to the public in its present state and is hugely instructive in terms of the actual processes of craftsmanship. And you can see here the nails which held the timber laths onto the brick wall. You can see that the columns, and these were really monumental columns in this hall, the structure was made up of timber laths. And you can also see the fragments which survive from Artari's scheme. On the lower image, you can see reeds were used by Artari as an armature around which to model the thighs of some of the monumental figures on the ceiling. So Clandon Park is hugely instructive, and I am working with the team at Clandon Park. I have a project in Trinity College called Craft Value, and we are working with the National Trust in thinking about ways of interpreting this wonderful layering that we can see, and in developing digital techniques to bring it to a wider audience. Giuseppe Artari ended his days, sadly, receiving charity from the court where he had last worked in Germany, while his associates Baguti, Vasali, and 2 of the Lafranchini brothers returned to spend their last days in their homeland. They exerted enormous influence on the native plasterers of Britain and Ireland, particularly in Ireland, where the virtuoso Dublin School of Plasterwork followed their example with brio. In conclusion, the research, analysis, and writing of Making Magnificence has been a voyage of discovery in more ways than one. It opened my eyes to the taskscape of the built environment and the fundamental role of craftsmanship in architecture, and has led to my current research project funded by the Irish Research Council on craft skills across several media in the architecture of Britain and Ireland in the 18th century. Thank you very much for listening.